Good morning, everyone. I love in this reading how after you hear about the foolish virgins and the bridegroom comes and says, basically, I see you not. And you just feel like, oh dear, because in some ways this reading, what is it to fail spiritually, feels frighteningly familiar. Feels like one of the first times I could get up here and speak about something I know a little bit about. But Swamiji leaves us in such an uplifted place, really, by the end of the reading, by the end of the Gita reading. Really, no good work is ever lost. Paramhansa Yogananda tells us that this life, every life, is a lot like school, and that we graduate many times. And that each graduation is really transcending all of those issues, everything in life that keeps us forgetting who we really are, that keeps us away from our soul nature, and that each time we live a life and we move forward, to whatever degree we move forward, because we all are moving forward at some speed or another, that we move a little closer to remembering, and that you can't really make a mistake as long as you keep your direction and your intention headed toward. Are we good here, Vinny? Good, okay. That if we have a child, and we all know this, who graduates from 4th grade to 5th grade, though they stay in the same school, they don't go into middle school, nothing really happens, but we never think that it's been a failure. Everything that they've learned in the 4th grade goes towards their ultimate education, their ultimate graduation. And that really is very much what each life is like for us. It's a possibility, we have the possibility to move away from everything that limits us, everything that keeps us bound to the notion of this body, this life as we see it, as Swamiji wrote here, and invites us, or gives us an opportunity to identify, not with this body, but in fact with that which is limitless. So to move away from everything limited and to begin to identify with everything, everywhere, to remember that we're one with all that is. And we cannot fail at this. It's simply our destiny to succeed. It's only a question of when we succeed. It's not a question of whether we will or not. The souls are on this long journey, and as long as we are walking this path, as long as we wake up, which is part of the analogy here in this story, as long as we even know that there's something to wake up to, which of course not everyone does, and in fact the vast majority of people don't know there's anything to wake up to. They don't know that they should want anything other than what they already have. But as long as we know that we want to wake up, then we will keep moving. And we will do as the parable said. We'll have ourselves ready, and we go through all of the symbolism in the parable. Swamiji didn't tell the whole parable here, but it's really quite beautiful. He talks about the wise virgins and the foolish virgins, but really goes on elsewhere to say that represents devotees everywhere. And of course, there are devotees at every level of spiritual progression. So you're not either wise or foolish. As he says in the end, you don't get just this one chance, but we decide which of these lives we'd like to live. We have our lamps, which ultimately represent our practices whether they're outward practices, rituals, pujas, whatever they are, or our inward practices. We have a wick in the lamp, which represents our heart, which we have to ready before we can light the lamp, and we have to have the lamps filled with oil, because no lamp can burn without oil, of course. And the oil represents our heart's devotion. And we know that the lamp can't burn with that. We cannot find our way to God without devotion burning behind every practice, everything we do in this life. If we know that we want to move on to welcome the bridegroom, which of course represents Christ consciousness in this story, if we want to ready ourselves for the moment that the bridegroom appears, then we have to do all of these other steps. And then we can say, we can wed our consciousness with Christ's consciousness. That's what it means when the bridegroom comes. But it's not always easy, of course. Nothing on the spiritual path is. I've been recently reading a lot of stories from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which most of you know are these epic poems from India. And I often say they're the breast milk and pablum for Indian children. They're raised on them, but we don't get to hear them. But they're extraordinary stories. Each character, just like in the Gita, each quality in any of those stories represents something, always amazing wisdom to be garnered there. And I've been reading them because of some classes that I'm going to be teaching. And recently I was reading pieces of the Ramayana. And it's so fascinating reading this wonderful work. The whole Ramayana is 24,000 stanzas, so I'm not reading all of it. But I was picking out certain pieces. And the Ramayana is based on the story of Rama and Sita, who, when joined together, their consciousness joined, represent Christ consciousness. They represent the divine, this perfect balance of male and female energy. And they live in Ayodhya, which is Rama's birthplace, which of course is then thought to be a very sacred place. Now, every story about them is told so that we can learn lessons on our spiritual path. And it's so interesting to see how even this energy which represents the divine can teach us exactly what's in this parable today. So the part I want to talk about a little bit, and I'll give you just a little background, is that Rama and Sita are wed, and they've been wed for 13 years. And the king, Rama's father, decides that it's time to pass the throne on to Rama. He loves Rama, he's devoted to Rama. And remember, Rama represents the divine here. So the king is devoted to God, and he wants to pass the kingdom on to him. But another one of the king's wives, who is not Rama's mother, gets very jealous, and she gets driven to come to Rama with two boons that he had promised her some time ago. She could ask for any two things, and right now she's going to turn them in, and what she says is she wants Rama to be banned to the forest for 14 years. And she does this, of course, so that he cannot become king. She wants her son to become king, not Rama. Well, the king is heartbroken over this, but Rama, representing the divine, receives the news with great calm, great poise, perfect obedience, and he readies himself to go off into the forest. His wife Sita does not want him to go alone. He wants her to stay back. He says, I'll go. It's dangerous. It's many things. You stay here. But very much in life, this will sound familiar to a lot of you, He's wooed by her female side. She becomes very convincing and goes off into the forest with him. So right away, it's starting to look a bit like our lives. But while they're there, many things happen. Sita becomes enamored with this beautiful golden deer that starts coming around to their cabin that they've built to live in. All a ploy on the part of evil to get her attention, but it works. She becomes enamored with the deer, and she says to Rama, I want you to catch that deer. I want you to go and get him and bring him back here so he can live with us. So Rama, against his better judgment, but once again wanting to please his wife, takes off to go and find the deer, but he leaves Lakshman watching Sita, and he says, don't take your eyes off of her, because there are evil forces here and they're trying to get us. Watch her. So Lakshman's watching her until Sita becomes worried about Rama now, because he's not coming back. And finally she convinces Lakshman to go and look for Rama, even though he's sworn that he won't leave her. So she's attached to the deer a little bit. Now she's attached to her fear for her husband. Lakshman cannot hold his ground. He leaves and he goes to look for Rama. And of course, the character in the story representing evil shows up, dressed as an ascetic, wins her heart, and she lets him in, at which point he kidnaps her. So Rama and Lakshman come back and Sita's gone. So it's just already rich with our human dilemma of how often there's a possibility for us to fail spiritually, which is what we're talking about in this reading over and over. Sita's drawn to the deer, then she lets in the evil man, she sends her husband off, all because of attachment to things outside of. She already had God right with her. She was already with Rama, and she's drawn to leave. This is the part of the story, though, that I want to focus on in a little detail. As they're looking for Sita, desperately looking for Sita, they meet along the way Hanuman. Hanuman is part of a monkey tribe that's half monkey and half human. And he becomes deeply devoted to Rama. In fact, he remains one of Rama's main and highest devotees. And Rama decides to send the monkeys in all different directions, north, south, east, and west, to look for Sita. And Hanuman is sent south. And they travel all the way south until they come to the end of land and they're at the sea. And they have reason to believe that Sita is on the other side of the sea in what was called Lanka, now known as Sri Lanka. But they have no way of getting across the water, none. And so they all become very despondent until one of the monkeys starts talking about the qualities that exist in each of the monkeys who are with Hanuman. And he says to each of them, weren't you very strong? Don't you believe that you could have done this in your life? And the monkey says, well, I could have, but that was before. Now I'm older. I can't do that. And then he says to the next monkey, didn't you have great courage? And the monkey says, well, I used to have great courage, but I can't do that anymore. But he's talking about all of these spiritual qualities in a very strong and positive way. And finally, he comes to Hanuman, and he says, Hanuman, what is wrong with you? And he says to him in a very strong voice, don't you know who you are? Which awakens in Hanuman the memory that he is the divine, that he already is the divine. And Hanuman in the story gathers his strength, he sits up straight, he draws his energy up his spine, and he starts expanding and expanding, and he gets huge. at which point he becomes as big as the mountain and gets on the top of the mountain and with all of his strength pushes off. And of course, he jumps across the ocean. Now, I'm not going to tell any more of the story there, but that could only happen when Hanuman remembered that he was God. The monkeys won this time, but they could never have done it on their own. They could never have done it if they didn't remember their true nature, that they were, in fact, soul, a part of God themselves. But it was very challenging for them. They ran into a lot of tests that they had trouble meeting until that moment when they remembered who they were. And then they were able to succeed. And of course, because we know Rama and Sita, we know the whole end of the story. And we know that God exists. So we know that they wound up finding Sita and bringing her back. And there's hundreds of more stories there. But you know, it's very much like our life. We're drawn away all the time. We have great tests to meet. And we meet some, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we actually fail at those tests, but we never fail completely. It's a momentary lapse. No matter what happens, as long as we see that mountain, and as long as we know that what our goal is to get to the top of the mountain. If we're headed up the mountain and we run into a diversion, or we run into a little scree and we fall backwards a little, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, because God knows who we are. As long as we stand up and we look to the top of the mountain again, and we put ourselves in that direction, and we go there. Our intention, our direction, where our heart is all that matters. Of course, there will be tests, because that's what karma is. And that's the whole purpose of life. And there's no way for us to grow other than by meeting our karmic challenges, which are, by definition and nature, as we talk about freeing ourselves from the ego's hold on us, going to be difficult. There's a wonderful story that I heard Bharat tell one time about a man who was in seclusion in a cabin, and he suddenly had a vision of God. This light shone and God appeared to him, and he said to him, "Come here, I want to show you something." And he takes him outside and he shows him this huge rock that is partially buried in the ground. And he said to him, "I want you to start pushing this rock." And so the man looks at the rock. I mean, it's huge, and it's underneath the ground, but God himself spoke to him. So he goes out every day and he pushes the rock. First day, the rock doesn't move at all. Second day, he just can't budge this rock. This goes on and on for a fairly long period of time. And then Satan appears one day, says to him, "What are you doing? You're being so crazy. You can't move that rock. You know you can't move that rock. But every day you're coming out here and pushing." He says to him, "Give up. It's silly. It's too hard of a job." And the man feels really despondent because God himself told him, push the rock. And so finally, he just starts praying and calling to God again, and God comes and says, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I failed. I failed in the test that you gave me. I've pushed this rock and I've pushed this rock, and it's not moved." And God said to him, "I never told you to move the rock. I told you to push the rock." And he said to him, "Look how strong you've become. Look what's happened to you just by pushing the rock, by doing what I asked of you. You didn't have to move the rock. You simply had to do what is asked of you, and though it was hard, though you were challenged, of course you were challenged. You did exactly what I asked, and look how much you've gained." And he received the divine blessing. It feels just like our lives. What we are asked to do is very, very hard. You know, yesterday I went down and I spent the whole day visiting a friend of Ananda. Many of us have talked about him many times, who's been in prison for 30-some years now, 35 years, his entire adult life, for a murder that he did not commit. But it's really, it's an experience going down there and being with him. He took Kriya very early on. There are days where he practices Kriya for 4, 6, 8 hours. He is a beautiful soul. But while you're there with him, you are exposed to all of what it means to be in prison. You hear a lot of the stories. I mean, I go down there for six hours with him. And the stories are, many of them, very dark. I'm not going to repeat any of them right now. The stories are dark. The people he's surrounded by are, to a large degree, dark. You're greeted and treated with one indignity after another, even as a visitor. I mean, you're just pushed and told what to do, and nobody treats you like you're a human being coming with your heart open, filled with love, no matter how much you smile or pray or keep yourself in your spine when you go there. It's really a lot of downward pulling energy. For 35 years, he's been in that. His sister, who went with me, was telling me, you know, every time he comes out to have a visitor, every time he goes back, he's strip searched. I mean, it's just, you really have to want to see the people who are coming to see you to go through even that. But 35 years, excuse me, day in and day out. And we were riding home, and his sister turned to me and said to me, "This has been a really great life for him." And I realized as she said it, I mean, of course, when you're with him, mostly what you talk about are the teachings, because that's what he's doing. That's how he saved his life. But I looked at her and I said, of course it is. Of course, it's been a great incarnation for him. But what an amazing, it took me a minute to get my mind around it and then out of the way. You know, Master says to us all the time, a successful life is not necessarily, or an easy life, is not necessarily a victorious life. So, and Master says over and over, continue to exercise your courage, because the only two things that matter, our Guru is not going to judge us on how many Kriyas we did last Tuesday. If we could only make it to 54 Kriyas or 30 minutes of meditation, or if we skip a day of meditation, it's not like we're dispensed with for this life. How much do we want to know God? How much are we willing to try? What gets in the way, not because they don't want to help us, but because they can't help us. If the lamps are not lit with the oil, if we're not doing our practices with devotion and with the deep desire, as much as anything, to know God, that's what they want to know. That's what devotion's about. That's why we always say, how much did you love? Master says, never focus any attention or energy on what you consider to be your failures. Don't do that. He said, move through everything that looks like an obstacle by inwardly calling on God over and over. Indifference and discouragement are the two things that can get us. Discouragement, which is of Satan, and paralyzes us. That's what happens when we feel discouraged. And indifference, because it drops our energy, and God simply has no way of reaching us. He can only reach us when we are willing, open channels, wanting Him. That is really what matters. Once we do that, it's like what the monkeys did. You try as hard as you can, then you leave it in God's hands because you couldn't have done it on your own. That little monkey was never going to jump across that ocean. And that ocean represents the oceans of delusions that we read about in the Gita all the time. We can't go there without God. This beautiful last line of the reading, no good work is ever lost. Every time we bring ourselves back. Oops, I've got to try again. I've got to put the next foot, one foot in front of the other. I've got to open my heart again. Not, oh my, look at what I did. Now I've blown everything. No, I'm moving forward. Here's where I'm going. This is why the other line in the Gita that is so beautiful, that we say every week, week after week. Why does Swamiji have us say it? Why did he put it in the festival? Even a little practice of this inward religion will free one from dire fears and colossal suffering. And a little practice of the inward religion means not just mindlessly doing rituals, not just mindlessly offering prayers, but doing it like the reading, like what Tandavu was reading. You read and you're saying to God, and you affirm, I am awake and ready. That silly little affirmation that we teach, not silly. That's all God has to hear. And immediately, our bridegroom will descend and meet us with open arms and bring us to that place of oneness in the divine.